Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you, to the Friends of Lucerne Festival, and it's a great privilege to welcome Maestro Kent Nagano here with us, speaking about, I think, one of the most interesting artistic projects that I have seen over the past years. Kent, a hearty welcome to you. I think you're just now in Zurich, conducting the Tonhalle Orchestra, and in between performances, relaxing. And thank you for being with us now.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Kent, when I read about this project, I think it was a little bit more, I thought it really was very, very interesting. I had certain questions to it. I didn't quite understand how Wagner, who was a composer of the Romantic period, not so long ago, not Baroque, not medieval, could be restored to authenticity. But you have created something together with Concerto Köln that's really outstanding. How did it all come about?
The very beginnings came from different sources. I was in the middle of working on a new Ring production with the Bayerische Staatsoper, with Andreas Kriegenburg, and it was a very intensive restudy period. And in preparation for that period, I was working very closely with the great Richard Trimborn, one of the great coaches, co-repetitor, who had worked with conductors such as Furtwängler. Karajan was one of the mainstays of Bayreuth for decades and decades. And we were in deep discussion about each one of the scores of the Ring, and we're going through carefully measure by measure. What was interesting in working with Richard Trimborn was his constant referral to the text. He said, yes, from his perspective of 50 years of working on the Ring and Wagner, he said, yes, it's true that there have emerged different fashions and different ways of interpreting Wagner. And he said the main foundation was always to carefully and methodologically go back to the sources. He said, interestingly, people's memory is always a bit subjective, which is to say, I remember that it has always been done in this way, or our tradition has been this way. He said that's, of course, true, and it's interesting, but that memory between two or three different people can recall different things. And he said that's why it's so incredibly important to return to the source material. At the same time, I was on tour with Concerto Köln. It was with Idomeneo, the opera, the great Mozart masterpiece. And one of the members came to me and said, yes, Mr. Nagano, we always enjoy touring with you. Your Bach, your Beethoven, your Mozart, but why don't you bring something of your other repertoire to us? And as a joke, I said, well, what do you mean? Should I bring Wagner to you? And the Concerto Köln member said, well, yes, for example. And that was the beginning of an extensive dialogue with Concerto Köln and myself. How and for what reason would it be interesting for Concerto Köln to leave their primarily Baroque, Vivaldi, Bach, and Mozart, Haydn repertoire and go forward into the contemporary world, or so to say, contemporary world of Richard Wagner? And together, a proposition was made that we would explore not only Wagner, but the evolutionary periods that took place in this fantastic 50-year period between young Beethoven, very late Mozart, systematically moving forward through the repertoire to experience as an ensemble the evolution of European music up to Richard Wagner, and to explore the various instruments that were being developed and playing techniques and playing fashions that were being developed in parallel to the Industrial Revolution. So it became suddenly a very complex exercise, a scientific exercise, a historical exercise, a performance praxis exercise. And the process we figured would take somewhere between 5 and 10 years, because the most important aspect, perhaps, of Lesarten was to work with a team of musicologists so that we would not only have creative impulses, but we would be able to publish the research data at the end, so that when the exercise was finished, we would leave behind resource material to which future scholars, future performers could refer. And that is what took place. That initial research period took about 4.5 years, and then we performed Rheingold about 1.5 years ago as the first installation of what our research had produced. And now we continue going forward. The interaction between the musicological team and the performers took place over a period, as I explained, about 4.5 years, nearly 5 years. Each time that a new discovery would be made, and sometimes, I must say, it was quite detailed forensic study. For example, to look at some lithographs which had been discovered, where it showed the hand position of a string player with a copy of the score behind that the player in the lithograph was playing. And we could actually look carefully at the hand position and the string that the player was going to perform to anticipate how and in what way the portamento would be taking place. So it was very, very, forensic, careful study beyond just simply written materials.
So portamento is with the bow, right?
Yes, and it's a
That's
connection.
What, as little as I remember, as a former violinist.
Yes, it's portamento means literally to carry a tone.
Yeah.
So it's how you connect two notes together.
Yeah.
And do you connect it from the top to the bottom, or do you connect it from the bottom to the top? And do you glissando, or do you inaudibly shift, or do you inaudibly shift for part of it and then hear a glissando towards the end? There are all different kinds of ways. We also looked. Fortunately, Wagner was quite a writer, and he wrote extensively about what his goals were, what his wish was, what his opinions were on other repertoire. And in going through this vast amount of written material, the musicologist would present it to Concerto Köln, and we would immediately apply it in a workshop setting. And we would, because sometimes words are limited in their understanding. And so we applied in many different ways, practically, what the words were suggesting, until we came up with a result that seemed to be in harmony with what Wagner's written vision was, or written hopes were. So that's why the process took so long. It was really careful. And the 5 musicologists came up with different kinds of perspectives, and we would try them all out. One of the musicologists was, for example, a specialist in the dialect which Wagner used, of the German dialect. It's not Hochdeutsch that we use today. It was a very special kind of German with a special sort of enunciation and a formation of both vowels and consonants. So we would apply these very, very carefully, and would see how we could support this articulation with the way that we were articulating in the woodwind instruments, for example. So again, the process has been very, very slow. But we agreed from the beginning, we meaning Concerto Köln and myself, is that we wouldn't actually fix a deadline to when we must complete the research. Instead, as each phase of research was done, as long as it took, then we would give a performance reflecting what the research suggested.
So, taking now the status quo where you are at now, of course, having performed Rheingold now several times, where do you stand in terms, where is the impact on the instrumental and vocal players and singers? What are the major changes, you would say?
The instruments have taken a long time to master. Thinking to the Industrial Revolution, perhaps the easiest example is to see and play on the various pianos of Beethoven, because Beethoven was very, very much tied into technological advances on his instruments. And if you go, for example, to the Bonn Beethoven house, you can see the different instruments and see how radically different the advances in the instruments were. And the composers of the time, and I would say the composers of today, embrace technology very much, and they use all of the technical means to try to allow a kind of realization of creativity. That was the case of Wagner, but the instruments were in quite a rapid phase of advancement because of new concepts of metallurgy, new concepts of sound, larger performance spaces. And some of the woodwind instruments were actually a combination of woodwind and metal that would be used during the Rheingold period, but perhaps were already obsolete by the time Götterdämmerung would take place. And especially perhaps the brass instruments were in a period of evolution. And it took quite a while for the say, for example, the trombone section. They were on a detective search and finally found brass instruments dating to the same period of Rheingold. And they needed to be restored because they were in an unplayable condition. Once they were restored, enough time had to be taken so that the players could master these instruments, because they were very, very different from modern instruments, very different from, say, the trombones that might have been used in Mozart's time. So one will hear immediately, in terms of klang and articulation, that these instruments are very, very transparent and much closer to what you might say the parlando way of playing. The kind of articulation that you can achieve on these instruments matches very well the kind of articulation that the libretto of Rheingold, how that sounds, what kind of textures it has, what kinds of colors it has. For the string instruments, we're using early Romantic instruments, but staying with the gut strings used at the time and with earlier bows. And in this case, many of the bows are reproductions of the bow, and which is to say they're made today, but based upon copies of the bows that were used at the time. And again, Romantic instruments, but using gut strings and an older fashion of a bow, it creates a completely different kind of sound texture that our modern ears might be used to. Mm-hmm. And a texture that's very different from, say, the kind of period Baroque performance praxis that we know today. So it's an interesting combination. Perhaps the most obvious to the modern listener is the diapason, is where the pitch sets. The pitch is lower, clearly and audibly lower than the diapason that we're used to today. Quite a bit of correspondence between Wagner and his potential presenters underscore how important the diapason was for Wagner as he thought about vocal timbre. For example, there is correspondence where Wagner refuses to go to London because he explains that diapason is too high and it won't allow the singers to really produce the kind of timbre that he wants. So all of this combined.
Which level was the diapason at those times?
Well, that's a very complicated discussion because there is correspondence that explains a bit of a conflict within the hand-chosen group of musicians that were playing Rheingold, where there was a bit of a dispute between the diapason between different members of the orchestra that needed somehow to be resolved. And it was resolved according to what allowed the singers to best realize their the telling of the story. Now that finally is one of the most together with the diapason, I would say maybe one of the most interesting things that one hears from this particular series of research is a type of voice and how they sing. Wagner refers very, very often to how important parlando is, how important the understanding of the text is, for the audience to be able to have an intimate contact with the storytelling by, without effort, being able to understand what the singer is singing, what they are saying. His choice of singers, we know at least intellectually that he was very, very close to the bel canto singing style, but yet was pushing the style into say a more theatrical dimension, dramatic tension. That meant that he was requiring the voices to go between theater speaking and vocal singing, bel canto singing. The choice, therefore, of the singers, we tried carefully to respect how Wagner chose his singers as well. So not only bel canto singing, but he tended to choose singers that had very, very clear text, not necessarily large voices. For example, he would choose from time to time operetta singers because they were so clear in their diction. And the choice of singers then that we chose would be considered unusual by today's standards, by the clarity of the diction and how they've been trained in terms of style and performance praxis is to glide or to go very, very carefully between a flexible singing style, meaning to transition between speaking and singing easily from time to time at certain points to emphasize dramatic moments, to use vibrato not as a textural presence, but actually as an ornamental or decorative presence. So using straight tone and vibrato really to emphasize the meaning of certain words. Portamento, as we spoke about before, to not simply use portamento freely or spontaneously, but tied to the content of the words, the content of the text. So carefully decorating or enhancing certain kinds of dramatic meaning in the text. So this, I think, results in something that a contemporary listener will remark upon almost instantly. I should say, by example, by the way, that in presenting Rheingold in this way, it is not at all meant as a criticism of modern Wagner performances. It's not at all to say that this is the only way that you should perform Wagner. It's music, as we know from living composers. It's meant to be expressed from people who live in their times, and for interpreters of their time to really interpret the music through their own experience. So it's not at all meant as a right or wrong way.
You know, we are also, you know, not a big one, but a smaller Wagner town. He's lived here 7 years.
Of course, of course.
And he didn't work on Rheingold, but he worked on the last act of Tristan. He's worked on Götterdämmerung, Siegfried Idyll, and yeah, probably had many more ideas. But so there is a connection, and I really find it fascinating, and also the vision of saying, if you want to take it further, you also have to go back and do research into the authentic material and to understand more how it was at those times and what the composer wanted. And very fascinating. I know this project is going on. You will continue with Walküre next year, I believe, or how are you developing it?
We left everything open. At the beginning, it was a Rheingold focus with maybe someday we'll work on the whole ring. But because of the experience of the Rheingold, we collectively took the decision that let's continue the research. It's interesting. Yes. And we joined forces with the Dresden Festival Orchestra, who are also specialists in early Romantic interpretation. And we are having workshops together now. We will then, in this new phase, perform Rheingold, and thanks to your invitation, we will make this premiere debut of this new ensemble in Lucerne. Then a new musicological team is put together now, simultaneously doing the work for Walküre. So the following year will be Walküre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my colleagues tell me that we're already talking about that. But now we are very, of course, focused and tremendously looking forward to August 22nd, when you will bring the Rheingold to us here in Lucerne and listen to the magic, authentic sounds of Richard Wagner here in Lucerne, in one of his beloved cities where he worked intensively. Just another thought, we just met in Hamburg at the Staatsoper when you did Shostakovich, Lady Macbeth of Mzensk. I just wanted to congratulate you. We didn't really have time to talk much. It was a fantastic performance. And rarely ever have I felt so involved. I mean, with the story, with the whole opera, but also with the music by Dmitri Shostakovich, and putting ourselves into the times we live in with terrible war going on in Ukraine. It really was an outstanding experience, for which I thank you very much, very personally.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I think all of us were very affected, exactly from what you said, by how relevant the score has remained. It raises issues that we are facing in 2023 and places it in such an intense encounter with the public today that I think all of us were deeply impressed with how this work, far from being maybe a fringe work, has become a mainstay of the repertoire because it's so universally relevant.
Mm-hmm. That was fabulous, I thought. Just a last question. Now, as you are very involved also with contemporary music, with the music of the last century, 20th century, do you think that in 100 years we'll be going back to scores by Weber and Schoenberg or by Wolfgang Riem and other contemporaries now, Hosokawa maybe, where you're performing tonight at the Tonhalle? We'll be going back and thinking, how did they do it in those times? What was the approach? And how much, on the other side, is technology developing the whole musical process of instruments, singing, You feel that there's still the same thrive going on in musical performance in terms of development?
Well, Michael, this is a very exciting and in a true way, confirmation that we should all remain optimistic.
Yeah.
Because from my perspective, as maybe a more senior member now, I remember when 20th century music performances were synonymous with avant-garde. And now a performance of 20th century music is standard repertoire. Mm-hmm. Isn't it amazing that in 23 short years, we can now look back with perspective and see that far from being a noisy, experimental century of irrelevant music, in fact, it was one of the richest centuries of contributing to our repertoire. Can you imagine a concert without Bolero? Can you imagine a concert without Sacre du Printemps or Petrushka? Can you imagine a concert without a Shostakovich symphony or Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story? Or it's been George Gershwin's repertoire, Olivier Messiaen's Turangalila. It's impossible to imagine a symphony's repertoire without including the 20th century. Right. So that in itself is a wonderful confirmation that yes, our tradition is going forward and is actually becoming richer and broader, not thinner and more abstract. Also, for someone like myself, a composition student who worked closely with Pierre Boulez, Olivier Messiaen, Henri Dutilleux, it's also very interesting because performance practice. Yes, I work carefully on Boulez's repertoire with Boulez, Dutilleux's music with Boulez, Bernstein's music with Bernstein, Olivier Messiaen's music with Messiaen. And to now hear their music be interpreted by a younger generation who did not have the privilege of working directly with these composers, and hearing how the interpretive nature is really evolving, this is, I would say, a source of great optimism as well. In my time, I think it would be fair to say that it was nearly impossible to separate a performer like Leonard Bernstein as a personality from the performances of his work. But now to see that, yes, his works have become repertoire and they're being interpreted by generations who never knew him. The same thing for Pierre Boulez's music. To hear performances of his music by people by young artists who have never had the chance or the privilege to meet Pierre Boulez. It's very, very encouraging. It means that our repertoire goes on into the future.
That makes me feel very well. And Kent, we thank you so much for your precious time here with us now at Michael and Friends. And we keep our fingers crossed for you for a great performance tonight in Zurich with the Tonale Orchestra, and a wonderful program, I must say, with Bach and Hosokawa and then Bruckner's 9. And speaking for, of course, also your artistic personality. And we're really tremendously looking forward to August 22nd to welcome you, a wonderful cast and Concerto Köln in this first authentic performance of Rheingold at Lucerne Festival. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You and your family all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and the same to you.